Okay, so let's get started. We were talking about threads last time. We just started this topic. We finished CPU scheduling. Okay, we have looked at how the CPU scheduler schedules processes. Some of those techniques apply to threads as well. Okay, but I'm going to first describe what are threads, and I described it last time. We'll just do a recap what threads are, and then we'll look at what an operating system needs to do to support threading. Okay? This is not a course on threads and thread programming. This is actually more our interest is how to use, not how to use, but how to implement threads. Okay? From an operating systems perspective. But in order to understand that, you first need to understand what threads are, and then you look at how they're implemented underneath. Okay, so I described what is a thread last time. Okay, just to recap, it's essentially a sequential stream of execution through an address space. Okay, an address space is a piece of memory. Okay, typically, when it is processed, there is one stream of execution. There's one entity that's the thread within that process that's executing instructions. When you have threads, there are multiple executing entities within the same process, which we will call a multi-threaded process. Each of these executing entities we call a thread, and that represents a sequential stream of execution through that address space. All of the threads share the code for that process. They share memory. Each of them has their own stack. Okay, they share all the global variables and whatnot, but they will have their own stack and their own heap. Okay? Not the heap, rather. Their own stack and their set of registers. Each is also shared. Okay. So that's the basic concept of a thread. We'll look at some examples in just a moment. Okay, so now before we go to some examples, I just want to portray how operating systems have looked at processes and threads over the ages. Okay, this is more not what the picture looks like today, but rather how it was evolved over time. Okay? In the very early days, you had very primitive operating systems. MS-DOS is an example, which supported a single process and a single thread within that process. This was the uniprogramming model. Okay, only one program can execute as a process, and there's one thread of control, which is shown by that arrow, twisted arrow there through that process. Okay. Now, later operating systems such as Ultrix and early versions of Unix generalized that model to multi-programming. Multi-programming, you have multiple processes that can execute, okay, and each processor was still a single-threaded process. Okay. This is early Unix, not today's Unix. Okay. So, multiple processes, single thread within each process. Okay. And then you had embedded operating systems which ran on embedded devices that still supported a single process but supported multiple threads within that process. So it was one process running within the system, but you could have multiple threads within that process. And this is what we have today. All modern operating systems will have a multi-programming model, and each process that's running can have one or more threads. Okay, so multi-threaded processes, multiple processes executing concurrently. Okay, so this is general purpose operating system. Embedded operating systems still support that model, specialized ones. Okay? These two are no longer supported by modern operating systems. They're too primitive unless there's a special case to be made to go back to those scenarios. Okay? Here is an example of producers and consumers using threads. This is pseudocode. Okay? This is not going to work on any language or anything like that, but just to illustrate the concept, what we are going to do is we are going to write producers and consumers as threaded application. Okay. 2 or 3 lectures ago, I showed you producers and consumers that were independent processes. They were independent address spaces, and we needed a shared buffer in the form of shared memory for the producer and consumer to communicate. Okay. At that point, I said when we look at threads, we'll see how to redo this within a single process. Now, the producer and consumer are within the same process. They share a buffer, but the buffer is now just an array that you're going to share. It's a shared data structure. You don't need to do anything special because all threads have access to all global variables, all shared variables. Okay? So you have a buffer n that is shared there. Okay? So that's, and then you have a producer code and the consumer code. The producer code and the consumer code are going to be run by one or more threads. Okay? If you have single producer, single consumer, you're going to have one thread that's executing the producer function, another thread that's executing the consumer function. Okay, and these will run concurrently. If you have a multi-core system, they will actually run in parallel. Thread 1 will run on core 1 and thread 2 might run on core 2. But even otherwise, you will have these two threads executing concurrently. They may get scheduled one after another or some in whatever order the scheduler wishes to schedule. Okay, this is the picture to keep in mind. Okay, this is your code or text segment. Okay, and the code for the producer and the code for the consumer are both in the text segment. And you will see there are two program counters, one for each thread. Okay, so think of it as one program counter is actually somewhere within this function is pointing to whatever statement is being executed in the producer, and the other program counter is in this function. It's executing the consumer code, and they are going to each execute concurrently. Okay? And the code for the producer and consumer is still the same. The producer is simply producing a data item and it sticks it into a circular buffer. The consumer pulls data item from the circular buffer and does some processing on that data. Okay? So that part hasn't changed. So you have a while loop where you simply increment the index into the buffer and you stick in the next data item in the buffer. In the producer, in the consumer, you look at what you have consumed so far, you look at the next entry in the array, okay, and you consume it. Okay, but now this is a threaded application. Okay, so there's a thread for a producer, there's a thread for a consumer. Okay, and then I have shown you how the thread is created. The fourth thread is not a real library function or a system call, it's just pseudocode to indicate you are creating a thread. Okay, so fourth thread producer creates a thread and makes it execute the producer code. Fourth thread consumer creates another thread and makes it execute the consumer code. And there are these two threads that are going to execute the two functions. Okay, any questions on this? This is just an illustrative example to show you how threads work. We are going to look at how thread libraries work next. Yes, question.
The way this is implemented now is one thread for a producer and one thread for a consumer.
Yes. I mean, the general case is an arbitrary number of producers and arbitrary number of consumers. It's a single producer, single consumer. Okay, we will look at how to generalize all of that. We haven't done synchronization yet. Okay, once you do synchronization, you'll see how to make this work. Yes, questions on that in the back. Okay, so the thing to keep in mind is threads allow you to have concurrency within a process. Okay, you can have concurrency across processes. You can write an application as a set of processes that all communicate with one another through shared buffer or message passing. So that's an application that has multiple independent processes. Or you can write your application as a set of threads that share an address space. The same process, multiple threads within the process, okay, as is shown in this scenario. Now, just to give you an example, I'm going to show you typical processes that run on a system, and you will see that by and large, most modern processes are multi-threaded. This may be hard to see or read, but if you look at, so that's the set of processes that are executing. You can also run top and see the same thing. This column here shows you the number of threads within each application that's running. Okay, so you will see that there is the very top, the Dropbox running, it has 43 threads. Okay, so that application has 43 threads. What they do, we don't know because that's within the application. You'll see Chrome has 38 threads, Skype has 37 threads, and so on and so forth. So if you look at most of the applications that run on your system, they are written as multi-threaded applications. So it's very important to understand what threads are, how you can use this concept of a thread to achieve concurrency within any modern application. Okay? So each thread is going to perform some task. If you have a web browser, one thread may be fetching data or a network from a web server. Another thread within the browser may be taking data that has been fetched and processing it and rendering it on a screen. A third thread may be doing something else. It may be fetching other things in the background and so on and so forth. So you can take any application, partition it into threads, and sort of implement your application in that fashion. Okay, so that's an example of threaded application or programs. And now what we are going to do is to with that background, and I presume some of this background was made available to you in 230, which does have some material on threads. So we will now look at how to implement threads from an OS perspective. Okay? So there are two ways to implement threads. One is referred to kernel level threads or kernel threads. The other technique is referred to as user level threads or user threads. And we'll see what the pros and cons are. Okay? So a kernel level thread, which is also referred to as a lightweight process or LWP, okay, is essentially a thread within a process that the application knows about. Okay? So the application, not the application, the OS knows about it. The OS is aware of the presence of threads within this process. Okay? What I just showed you, which was activity monitor and showing you how many threads were within each process, should immediately indicate to you that those are kernel level threads, because the kernel can see that this process has 37 threads inside it. And it can figure out what those, how to schedule them and so on and so on. Okay? So kernel threads are threads that the OS knows about. Okay? And in this case, if you have kernel level threads, switching between threads is somewhat similar to context switching between processes. Okay? If you want to schedule one thread and then its time slice runs out, you are going to save the state of that thread, which is its registers will be saved, and then you may resume execution of another thread. That other thread belongs to the same process. You don't have to save the other memory management information because that's common for the thread. Only the registers have to be saved and the new set of registers have to be loaded. So you can context switch between threads just as you could context switch between processes. Okay? So just the same CPU scheduling techniques we were looking at last time would apply to scheduling kernel threads as well. Okay? So you have to save the values of the register, program counter, stack, pointers, etc. Memory management information doesn't need to be saved if the next thread to be scheduled is the thread of the same process. The next thread is a thread of a different process. You are also switching processes while you are switching threads. In that case, you have to save everything from process A and then load the context of process B, which is all of its registers and memory management information, such as page tables and so on. So that's context switching between kernel level threads. And then the other thing that goes along with that is if the kernel is made aware of the presence of threads, it can schedule those threads explicitly. Okay? So if one process has 20 threads and the other process has 2 threads, the process that has 20 threads, if you do round robin scheduling, say, the process that has 20 threads will get 20 time slices when the second process gets 2 time slices. So more threads will get you more CPU time, okay, because those threads will get scheduled more frequently than threads of a process that has fewer threads, okay, by definition. Because if you're just doing round robin, you have 20 of threads of process A waiting in the queue, and then some other process may have fewer threads. Okay? So you can express the kernel must schedule the threads if they are kernel level threads, and it can use the same scheduling algorithms, and processes that have more threads or more work to do can get more CPU time. Okay? And the other thing that I have on the slide is switching between threads is faster than switching between processes, simply because the context switching requires you to save less state if you don't have the same memory management, because that's common for threads within the same process. Okay. Now, you can look at the other side of the picture, which is user level threads. Okay. User level threads, also called user threads, are threads that OS does not know about. Okay. So typically, this threading functionality is implemented by a library without any explicit OS support. Okay. So all of the thread management is done inside a user level library. So when you say create a thread, that's a function call to a library, not a system call to the OS. In kernel level threads, when you create a thread, that triggers a system call so that the OS can set up state for the thread within the process control block and so on. When you user level thread, none of that has to happen. You just make a call to a function, call a function that goes to a library, and the library creates all the thread for you. The OS is unaware of the presence of thread. So from an OS perspective, this process is going to look like a traditional single-threaded process, even though inside there may be 20 user-level threads. The OS cannot see those threads. The OS is not aware of the presence of this. All the threads are managed by a library. Okay? So In this case, the OS can only schedule processes. It cannot explicitly schedule the threads within a process. Okay? So the CPU scheduler in this case is going to schedule process A. Okay? And then the library will run its own thread scheduler and decide whenever the process is scheduled, which of its threads are going to be scheduled. So it's a two-level scheduling decision. Okay? The OS schedules the process. Okay? The library that implements threads is going to pick which thread gets to run whenever the process gets to run. Okay? So this is how scheduling is going to work in this scenario. Okay? Because OS cannot directly schedule a thread. In kernel level thread, the OS could have actually picked a thread directly to run. It doesn't have to pick a process and then a thread. It can directly pick a thread and that will implicitly belong to a process. Okay, so there's a thread library to manage threads, okay, so which is going to allow creation, deletion, synchronization, and so on, including the scheduling. Okay, here's a picture of what I was just saying. Okay, so these are processes. Okay, from a kernel's perspective, they look like single-threaded processes. Okay, when your user-level thread packages, you can't see the threads inside the process. But if you actually look at what the user-level library sees, you will see that there are multiple threads within it. The OS cannot see them. Okay, so it can only schedule the process, and then your threads library, which is a user-level thread scheduler, right, is going to decide which of those threads to run whenever the process runs. Right? So the kernel will pick one thread, one process rather from the ready queue, and then the user-level scheduler is going to pick one thread from its ready queue, okay, and then it will decide which thread to run. Okay, so two-level decisions. Okay. Now in this case, if you have some processes that have more threads than other processes, the kernel cannot favor a process that has more threads because it doesn't see those threads. It doesn't know that there are a lot more threads there, so it should be that process should be given more CPU time. Okay. In kernel level scheduling or kernel level thread scheduling, you will automatically get more CPU time if you have more threads that are ready to run. Yes, question.
From a programmer's perspective, how do these two differ?
Okay, that's a good point. I was going to come to that. So I've only talked about the OS perspective. So the question is, what changes from a programmer's perspective? How does the programmer, you, use user-level threads versus kernel level threads? And the answer is it doesn't do anything different. Right? The API is going to be the same. How the threads are implemented internally is not your problem. Right? So you just call, let's say you have a JVM. Okay? All Java virtual machine support threads. Okay, when you use Java threads, you call thread create in Java. You don't have to worry about it as the underlying JVM use kernel level threads or user level thread. It is providing you threading functionality. The threads work exactly the same from an application standpoint. Okay, they won't be any different. What is different is underneath how they have been implemented. One makes use of OS functionality, the other does not. And there are pros and cons of which method provides you what benefits and what disadvantages. Okay? Any other questions on user level threads? So from a programmer's perspective, none of this should matter. This is peeking underneath, saying how is threading actually implemented by your threads library or the JVM, whatever entity is implementing threads. Okay, so now we look at advantages and disadvantages. The advantages of user level threads is when you switch between threads of the same process, it's going to be much faster than kernel level thread context switches, because switching between threads is simply a function call to a threads library. It doesn't need any OS involvement because OS doesn't even know about these threads. Okay, so the threads library is simply going to stop one thread and start another thread. No system call involved, no OS intervention involved. So this can be done much faster than switching between kernel level threads, which is like a context switch. It's a lighter weight version of a real context switch. Okay? So it's more efficient when you have user level thread to do context switches. Okay? The other point is that from an application programmer's perspective, user level thread scheduling is more flexible. Okay? If you need a special purpose scheduling technique for your application that you're writing, you can simply pick a user level threads library that provides you that functionality. Okay? So there are many of these libraries that implement different underlying thread scheduling policies. Maybe one does round robin, the other one does multi-level feedback, whatever it is. you can pick the right one. Okay? Now, if you pick kernel level threads, you are going to be stuck with whatever kernel level CPU scheduling policy is implemented in there. Okay? You can't go and unless your source code access, you will have to change the CPU scheduler, literally to change the policy, which is not something anyone typically does. Okay, but picking between different libraries that implement different policies, certainly you can do. Okay, so it's more flexible because you can decide which scheduling policy you use independent of whatever the OS is doing. Okay, the OS will implement its own policy. You can pick the library that implements the policy you need for your system, for your application rather. Okay, and the other thing is user level threads do not typically involve any system call. Okay? When you create them or delete them or you use any synchronization methods, all of those are library functions. Okay? Much more efficient than invoking system calls. Okay, these are all advantages of user level threads. Okay, now let's look at disadvantages of user level threads. Okay, so one major disadvantage of user level threads is that it cannot actually take advantage of some of the underlying kernel provided features that allow you to overlap I/O and computation. Okay? So let's say you have two threads within your application. Okay? Thread 1 runs and does I/O. Okay? So that thread has to go and wait for the I/O to finish. Now, since the OS doesn't know about the presence of threads at all, it will not know that there is a second thread that is ready to run. So it will block the entire process if any one thread within that process does I/O, even though other threads are ready to run. Okay? So in user level threads packages, if one thread blocks, the entire process blocks. Okay? In kernel level thread packages, if one thread blocks, only that thread is blocked. Okay? Because the kernel knows about other threads, it can only put that thread on the wait queue and the other threads can still sit in the ready queue and get scheduled. So the process as a whole can continue to make progress even if some of the threads are blocked. The other threads can get scheduled. This is a big difference between user level and kernel level. So I said scheduling policies are more flexible in user level threads. But from an OS perspective, if one thread is going to block, your entire process is going to get blocked. No other thread can make progress. Okay? So that's an important disadvantage. And a corollary of this disadvantage is user level threads packages also cannot take advantage of multiple cores that you may have. Okay? Since it's one process and you can only schedule that process, not explicitly schedule threads within the process, you will only run on one core at a time. Okay? So a kernel level thread packages, you can actually schedule two threads on the same process in parallel on two different cores. So that's an aside, but more important point is if one thread blocks, everything is going to block, and then you will not be able to make progress. Okay. And then I already mentioned that when I talked about kernel level threads, if you have more threads in kernel level thread packages, you can get scheduled more often if you use policies like round robin or multi-level feedback. That's not the case in user level threads. Okay. So what you should understand is all the advantages of user level threads are disadvantages of kernel level threads. All the disadvantages of user level threads become advantages of kernel level threads because they're exactly the opposites of one another. Anything you cannot do in one regime, you can do better in the other regime and vice versa. Any questions on this? Okay, so I'm going to show you a few more concepts and then we'll look at some other aspects of threading. Okay. So what is shown here is a much more complicated scenario of how threads map onto kernel level entities called lightweight processes and so on. So this example is Solaris, which is a commercial Unix operating system. Okay. It uses a model that is more complicated than simple kernel level threads, okay? Or just simple user level threads. It's a hybrid model and it's a multi-level scheduling model. So what happens in Solaris is Solaris does support kernel level thread. All modern operating systems do for that matter. Okay? They all know about they do support kernel level thread. User level thread packages are available, but so are kernel level thread packages widely. Okay, so Solaris supports kernel level thread as I showed here. Okay, what is the square box there is the address space. Okay? Within that address space, you see that there are threads. Okay? Those threads are directly mapped to kernel level threads in most cases, as they should. Okay? That's your traditional kernel level thread model. Okay? But what Solaris does is give you additional flexibility. It allows you to take two threads within an application and map it to a single entity, okay? Or n threads within an application and map it to a single kernel level entity. Okay? And that is what is shown in this picture. If you see there are two threads within the application. They are both mapped onto this kernel level thread. So what that means is when this kernel level thread is scheduled, okay, your application has to decide which of those two threads to actually run. And this is n:1 mapping. Okay. Here's the other scenario where you have 1:1 mapping. There's one user level thread that's mapped onto this kernel level thread. Whenever the CPU scheduler picks this thread to run, that user level thread within that application will run. There is no other additional decision to be made. That's a straightforward 1:1 mapping. Okay. But you can decide as an application programmer saying, should I actually dedicate an entire kernel level thread for my user level thread, or should I have multiple user level threads or application threads mapped onto one kernel level threads? Okay. So this is, and you will see that there is more complicated mapping. This is a many-to-many mapping that is shown here, where each user level thread can be mapped to multiple kernel level threads. Okay. So these kernel level threads are shared by two kernel level threads are shared by three user level threads. Okay. In this case, the application designer has to create this mapping. They are not going to get created automatically. There is going to be a default, and the default is this 1:1 mapping, which is a traditional kernel level thread model. So you can have sophisticated schemes that allow you to create threads within your application and map it into kernel level entities, which we will call kernel level thread, and decide how they get scheduled whenever one user level thread, one kernel level thread gets scheduled. Okay, so I'm going to show you another picture that generalizes this. So these are various threading models. Okay? So this model here is a standard user level threads package. Okay? All the threads within your application, okay, are mapped onto one entity the kernel knows about, and that's the process. That's a many-to-one mapping. Okay? So the kernel will always schedule this process, and then something else will have to decide which of those user level threads to run. Okay? So user level threads are actually a many-to-one mapping in this threading model. Okay. Here you have a one-to-one mapping, where each user level thread is mapped onto a single kernel level thread. Okay. So whenever this kernel level thread is scheduled, that user level thread within that application will run. Okay. So all kernel level thread packages default to a one-to-one mapping. All user level threads are this model. Because in this case you can't actually see the thread there, you can only see one kernel level thread. Here, for each user level thread, the kernel knows about a kernel level thread because of this one-to-one mapping. Okay? Yes, question.
In my case, if you have all the user level threads and you have the kernel level threads, is there a difference?
Okay, the question is, if there's a user level thread that's mapped onto a kernel level thread, is there a difference between the two? So I'm just showing you what we call a user level threads package. Okay? What that is actually from a kernel's perspective. All user level thread packages look like this from a kernel's perspective. The kernel is only aware of the process and one thread within that process, which is that thread. Okay? That's a traditional single threaded process. And within the process, you have multiple user level threads. So you schedule the process, the user level threads library schedules the thread within the process. Okay? All kernel level threads packages map onto this model. Right? Whenever you create a thread within an application, the kernel creates a thread within that kernel and maps that thread directly. Okay? So here the term user level thread is not the same as user level threads package. User level thread simply means a thread within an application. A kernel level thread simply means a thread that the kernel can see. So there's a small distinction between what I was talking about in the last two slides and how this term is used here. Yes, question.
So in the case of like one-to-one mapping, who will schedule the threads?
Okay. Question is, in the case of one-to-one mapping, who's going to schedule the threads? Okay. So the CPU scheduler is going to schedule kernel level threads. Okay. And if you pick any of those kernel level threads, since there's only one user level thread mapped onto it, you're going to run that thread by default. So if you pick this one, the scheduler picks this one, that thread, the blue thread that's attached to it is going to run. So there's nothing more to do. Okay. In this case, you actually have to make a decision. When this process runs, you have to decide which of those 4 threads or 5 threads that are mapped onto it will actually get to execute. Yeah, otherwise, you will not know what will happen. Yes, question.
So if it's 1-to-1, and like one of the user threads is blocking, it's not going to block the whole process.
Yes. So question is, if it's 1-to-1, if the user level thread blocks, will it block the entire process? So in this case, let's say a process has 2 threads. Okay? First thread is mapped onto this kernel level thread, the second thread is mapped onto this other kernel level. So if this thread does I/O, okay, it's going to get blocked, but that thread is independent of the first thread. So that kernel level thread will still be in the ready queue and you will be able to run it. Okay, so one blocking of one thread doesn't block the other thread. In this case, okay, this is the only information that the kernel has about this process. Okay? So if this thread, if any of those user level threads do I/O, the entire kernel level thread goes off on the wait queue, so none of those other threads will ever get scheduled. It's the same thing that I mentioned previously. Okay. So yeah, many-to-one, 1:1 mapping, and you will see that there is a many-to-many mapping, and this is what you can do in Solaris. You can decide what mapping you want. Okay. In general, you are going to be either in this mode or that mode, depending on whether you have a kernel level threads package. By default, you get 1:1, or if you use a user level thread package, you get many-to-1. Only operating systems like Solaris allow you to do this or this, where when you create a thread, you do pthread create, or you do Java thread create, you can explicitly specify parameters that say bind it to an existing kernel level thread, create a new thread and attach it, so you can specify all of these additional details and create systems or applications that might look like this. Okay. Most applications either look like this or that, depending on which of the 2 packages you use. Okay. In Solaris, you can do these additional things. Yes, question.
In the many ones, if a thread has I/O, it blocks the entire thing. Does that also apply to many?
Okay. Does that also apply to many-to-many? So that's a good question, right? So the question is, if you have this model and one user level thread does I/O, let's say just printf, what is going to get blocked? Right? That's the question, right? So now let's say you have to understand how this will actually work. Right? So this is a many-to-many model. So let's say you run the CPU scheduler pick this kernel level thread. Right? Then you run a user level threads package and ask what are all the threads mapped onto this and which of those threads run next. So all of these threads are mapped here. So you may say I'm going to run this thread. Okay? So that thread runs, it gets a time slice and it does I/O. Okay? When it does I/O, the kernel level thread that was attached to it at this point in time is going to get blocked, and so is that user level threads. Okay, so this is gone to wait queue, and so is this kernel level threads. But these 2 other threads are still available, and all the other threads are still available to run. So they can still make progress. Okay? You won't actually want to block other kernel level threads. Okay? Any other questions?
From what it seems, many is a lot more, like, in general, more useful than many-to-one, 1-to-1. But is that because of convenience to sophistication trade-off?
Yeah, so question is, this seems more useful than the other 2. It is certainly more flexible. Whether it's more useful is a matter of point of view, because it's more complicated, right? You have to create this mapping. The OS is not going to do it automatically for you. When you write a program and it has 10 threads, you get to choose which of those threads. So you could do this, saying these 4 threads I'm going to share between these kernel levels. This is an important user level thread, so I'm going to give it its own kernel level thread. You can make all of this decision, but it complicates your application. You have to analyze what each thread is doing, what it is relative importance within the application. Should it share kernel level thread with other user level thread? Should it get its own kernel level thread? You have to decide all this. If you're willing to do that, you get all the flexibility you want. You're not stuck with one of those 2 models. Okay. So by default, in kernel level threads model, you're going to get this. For every user level thread, you get its own kernel level thread, which means you may waste resources because you may get more kernel level threads than you need. Okay, here you have more user level threads sharing fewer kernel level threads. It's more efficient use of system resources. But you have to design your application and optimize it in this fashion to do it all. Any other questions here? So these are threading models to keep in mind, and as I said, by default, depending on whether your system is using a user level package, you will be in this regime. If you use a kernel level threads package, you will be in that regime. Okay, only if you write an application to do these, you will actually get scenarios that look like many to many and so on. Okay, so I mentioned this already. So I'm going to briefly mention some threads libraries that you will typically use. The two that are popular use, this one is in the C world, you have something called pthreads or POSIX threads, and then in the Java world, you have Java threads. Windows has its own threading package, which is Win32 threads. Okay, so let's look at pthreads first. So pthreads is a POSIX standard. What that means is any system that implements this standard will allow your code to run unmodified. Okay, so if you write your application, and this is typically a C or a C++ application, if you write it using the POSIX threads package, because it is a standard, any library that implements a POSIX threads package on any OS will allow your application to run. Okay, so it is very easy and portable to many different platforms. It's a widely used threading package. Okay? You can run the same code on a Mac, it can run on Linux, it can run on Windows because POSIX threads libraries are available on all of those platforms. Okay? So you can write cross-platform code using POSIX thread because it is a standard. Okay? And this is the common way to write threaded code in most Unix-like operating system. In fact, it is the default threading package in most of the Unix-like operating system, Linux, BSD, Solaris, even Mac OS X, you can use pthreads. Okay? Now in the Windows, you have your own window implementation of threads, which is called Win32 threads. Windows also supports POSIX threads, but the native threading package of Windows is not POSIX threads, it's Win32 threads. POSIX threads is a library that's implemented that uses Win32 threads underneath. Okay, so you basically just do the translation from one API to another API. Okay? And then the third very common threading package is Java threads. So if you write a Java application and use threads within Java, you're using the JVM's implementation of threads, and that's Java thread. And a different interface you write this your code in Java. And we'll show some examples as we go along of all of these. Okay, so here are some very small snippets of code to show you how to create a thread in 3 different platforms. Okay? In POSIX threads, you're going to call pthread create. Okay? That's the call you make to the library to create a thread. Okay? In Win32 thread, you're going to call a function that's called create thread. Okay? In Java, you just call new thread. Okay, you do a new on threads, and that will give you a new Java thread. Okay? And then you have to start the thread in the next stage. Okay? So this is just small snippet to show you how to create a thread in Java, how to create on a Windows platform, how to do this in C or C++. Okay? When you do some subsequent assignments, you will encounter at least some subset of these, not all of them. Okay? Now notice that none of these APIs, okay, this is how programmers deal with threads within the application. This API doesn't tell you how the package is actually implementing threads. That could be user level or kernel level thread depending on what OS it's running. Okay? And that should be transparent to you, the program. That's what an OS designer job is saying. I am writing a JVM. How do I implement threads within this JVM on this platform? Okay? Should we use user level or kernel level? Okay? Once you do that, any Java code is still going to call new and thread, and it will work the same way. It shouldn't matter whether the underlying threads are user level or kernel level. Yeah, that's an implementation issue for somebody who's implementing runtime systems and the OS. Okay? Not for the programmer. Okay? The programmer's code is going to use this API. Okay? It doesn't actually matter whether underneath your user level or kernel level threads. Okay? So that's basically threads, and then I'm going to start our next topic, which is on synchronization, but I'm going to take a brief pause to see if there are any questions. Okay? So I'm assuming all of you have encountered threads. It's not the first time we're hearing the term, but since we are going a little deeper into the concept of threads and implementation, we should see if the question is.
Does fork implement a kernel level thread?
Okay, that's a good question. So, does fork implement a kernel level thread? Fork is operating at a process level, not operating at a thread level. Okay? Fork creates a new process. That's a new address space. By default, a process consists of one thread. What I said is a single threaded process is a traditional process. Okay? So that's a process. You know, the process is obviously visible to the operating system. So from our perspective of threading discussion, this is a process that has a single thread. So it is equivalent to a kernel level thread. There's only one thread within the process. Okay, so, but it's not really a thread. We're actually in the world of processes when we talk about code, not threads. Any other questions here? Okay, so the distinction between processes and threads should also be clear. Okay, what do processes do? What do multi-threaded processes do? Which is multiple threads within the process. Okay, they are two very different things. Okay, so we will talk now about synchronization next, and I presume you probably have actually gone through some of this material in 230. If you want to do the too much milk problem to motivate synchronization, I presume that's what is used in 230. It's not doesn't matter. So I will use that to motivate what synchronization is. We look at locks, semaphores, monitors. Again, some of these concepts we have encountered, but here our goal is to understand from an OS perspective, how do you implement synchronization? When you say lock, okay, let's say you use a lock within Java or C or C++, what is actually happening underneath? Just as when we said, when you create a thread, what's happening underneath? The kernel level thread, the user level thread, what are the pros and cons? We look at the same thing. Okay? We study the concept of synchronization. We'll also look at how these are implemented underneath in the OS. What OS functions do you need to implement synchronization? Okay, so that's basically the goal. So I'm going to start with too much milk, which you probably have seen in 230. We'll go through it again, just as a refresher. Then I'm going to use locks as our first synchronization primitive. Okay, and you should understand you need synchronization to implement any multi-threaded code. That will again become clear through this example of too much milk. Okay. So before I even define what synchronization is, I'm going to show you this example of too much milk, which you've probably seen before, but here is what it is. Okay, so let's say, this is you and your roommate or dorm person you're sharing a dorm with are trying to collaborate on a task which is to ensure that your fridge always has milk in it. Okay. So what that means is if you run out of milk, somebody has to go get milk. Here's an example of how this may work and what could go wrong when you try to do this very simple task. Okay? So let's say you arrive at 3. Okay? You look in the fridge, there is no milk. You leave for the grocery store at 3:10. Okay? And now while you are out buying milk, your roommate arrives, okay? Looks in the fridge, sees no milk, goes off to buy milk as well. Okay? And now while your roommate is actually at the grocery store, you bought milk, you arrive home with the milk. Sometime later, your roommate arrives home with milk and now you have too much milk. You bought more than you needed. So this just shows that if you do not coordinate on a simple task, things may go wrong. Yeah, the opposite may also be true. You may be the lazy person, you arrive and say, no milk in the fridge, saying my roommate is going to buy it later, so I'm going to go off and do something else. So you go off and do something else. Your roommate may also be lazy and decide that it's not my problem, it's the other person's problem, and now you no milk. Okay. So you can have too much milk or no milk at all because you are not coordinating this task. Okay. It requires you to share and coordinate something for you to get to a correct solution, which is you always have milk, never run out of milk, neither do you have too much milk. Okay. So now we want to address this problem, and this is a simple example to motivate why you need to coordinate, and that is going to be the crux of synchronization as well. Okay? Whatever you see here, same thing may happen if you write multi-threaded code and do not write it correct without synchronization primitive. If you do not coordinate, same thing may happen. Okay? Threads may get scheduled in some arbitrary order and bad things may happen, or nothing may happen. Okay? And as we will see in just a moment. Okay. So now that's the example, and we'll see how to solve that example. But here are some terms which we will use, and I'm going to define them one at a time so that we are all on the same page. So synchronization, what does that mean? Okay, so it is basically a use of some atomic operations to ensure that there's cooperation between threads. Okay? The threads are coordinating with one another, and to ensure correct coordination or cooperation, you have to use some atomic operation. Okay? Now, what does atomic mean? Atomic means all or nothing. Okay? An atomic operation is either the whole operation succeeds or nothing happens. You can't do partial operations and stop in the middle. Okay? Any atomic statement means either you execute the whole statement, okay, or you don't execute the statement at all. But you can never execute half the statement. Okay? So it's sort of one granular piece that you're going to execute. And we'll come back to atomicity. I just gave you an informal idea of what that means. But essentially, it's use of some primitives or atomic operations to ensure cooperation. Okay? And then there are two other terms that are related: mutual exclusion and critical section. Okay? Mutual exclusion essentially says that only one thread gets to do a particular activity at any given point in time. And it explicitly excludes other tasks from doing the same activity while it is performing that activity. Okay? So that's what we mean by exclusion. Okay? So if thread A is doing a certain activity and it uses mutual exclusion, it's going to prevent all other threads from performing that activity at that point in time. Okay? So that's what is referred to as mutual exclusion. How to implement mutual exclusion, we will see. Okay? That's what we are going to use locks and things like that for. Okay, critical section is a related term. Okay, so in this, but slightly different. So it's a piece of code that any thread, only one thread can execute at any time. Okay? A critical section will be implemented using mutual exclusion. Because it's normally, if you have a piece of code that is not protected, okay, multiple threads can execute it concurrently. Okay? Two threads can call the same function and execute that function concurrently. But if that piece of code is a critical section, and you are implementing mutual exclusion, what will happen is one thread is in executing the piece of code, and it will prevent other threads from executing through mutual exclusion. Okay? So synchronization is how to have cooperation. Mutual exclusion is when you do something, how do you prevent all other threads from doing the same activity, performing the same activity. Critical section is a piece of code that only one thread can execute at any given time. Okay? No more. Okay? And then lock is a primitive that we are going to use to do all of those things. Okay? It's going to implement synchronization, exclusion in the critical section. So it's a mechanism for preventing other threads from executing something. Okay? So the way this is going to work is before you execute a piece of code that needs to be protected, you are going to acquire a lock. And when you exit that piece of code, you're going to release the lock. The piece of code that is protected is going to be called a critical section. The way you are going to protect it is the lock is going to prevent more than one entity from executing it. It's going to implement mutual exclusion for us. Okay? And we'll see examples of how to do all of this. These are just terms at this point. Just keep what I said in mind and we'll go through examples to see how all of this works. Okay? Any questions about the terms here before I move forward and show you how to do it?
You say that the lock is cancelled to prevent a process by processing threads.
Okay, so that's a typo. It should be a thread. You can have lock at process level also, but in this course we are only going to look at threading and locking. So prevent another thread from doing something. Okay, not a process. We can also have process level lock. So, but that's not what we are studying here. Okay, any other questions here? Okay, so now let's try to solve the too much milk problem and understand how synchronization works, how critical sections work, and so on and so forth. Okay, so first solution, okay, you need to somehow communicate or collaborate with your roommate to solve the too much milk problem. Okay, so how do you do this? Okay, you are going to arrive, you are going to look at the fridge, if there isn't enough milk, you are going to go off to the grocery store to buy milk, but you are going to leave a note saying, I am going off to the grocery store, I am off to buy milk. Okay. So you are going to use this note to communicate with your roommate saying, look, if you come and look at the fridge and see it's empty, and if there is a note there, don't bother, because I am going to do the task. Okay? So that's one way to solve the problem. So here is the code to do that. Okay, so you are going to basically say if there is no milk and there is no node, okay, you are going to leave a node and go and buy milk. Okay, and then you are going to remove the node. Okay? And then thread B is also going to do the same thing. Okay, now instead of people, we are now these are threads doing these tasks. So you are going to check, is there no milk? And if there is no node, then you should go buy milk. Okay? So that's a solution. Now question is, does it work? Is there any issues with this solution? Yes.
Provided that you check for no node and then leave a node with a test consent, it should be.
Okay, so we are talking about test consent which we have not encountered. I'm just asking you to think at a level of a person. What can go wrong? But you're right, but we haven't actually gone through that. I want to introduce what that is. So more conceptually, there's a way to say the same thing. Yes.
At the very beginning, there's no milk and no nut, so both of them enter the if statement and they both leave it out at the same time. So they're still both fine though.
Okay. Good point. Anybody else has anything else? I'm going to come back to what you said and reiterate that point in just a second. Yes.
They have the designated milk node leaving place, and they're probably going to be fine because they'll just see each other leaving.
Okay. They all come at the same time, of course, we talk to them. We don't need to communicate with both, so send extend messages to each other, but yes, that's true. You can. But that was in the threading world, what that means is if you're actually running in parallel, you can communicate rate. If you are going to be scheduled one after another, you have to use other mechanism to communicate. Yeah, that statement was not made in jest, it actually brings up this question, or you have something to say. Okay, so let's come back to the point that was made, which is how these threads get scheduled. Okay, the crux of synchronization is you have to assume that the OS can schedule threads in whatever order it wants. Time slices can expire whenever they expire, and your code should still run. Your code shouldn't depend on the OS scheduling these threads in a certain order. The code shouldn't depend on whatever the scheduling algorithm that the OS is using. It should always be correct. It should not be dependent on the OS level things like the time slice expired 10 milliseconds later and something happened. This shouldn't be the case. It should always be right. Okay? So now in this case, what is going to happen was exactly the point that was made. We will assume that thread A runs first. Right? It's going to come and execute this if statement, and let's assume that there is no milk and there is no node. Okay? So the thread A is going to now enter the if statement. Okay, where it is supposed to leave a note and buy milk. Okay. But now let's assume that just as it executes the if and is entering the if, the time slice for thread A expires. Okay. So now the thread is going to give up its time slice. The CPU scheduler is going to run. Pick another thread. Okay. Let's, for simplicity, assume it runs thread B. Okay. So thread B is going to run. Okay. It's going to see, is there milk? Thread A hasn't yet bought milk, so there's still no milk. Let's say, is there a note? Okay. There is no note yet because you have not actually executed the leave note. Your time slice expired before your leave note statement could execute. Okay, we just entered the if statement. Okay. So thread B is also now going to enter the if statement. Okay. Now you are in trouble. Okay, because the whole point of this code was that only one process or one thread in this case should enter the if statement if there is no note and no milk. Okay. So you are basically both going to leave notes and both going to buy milk because you already done the check. Okay. So now both of these threads are in the if statement, they are going to both buy milk, you have too much milk. Okay. So this code clearly will not work. It depends on a certain way in which the thread schedule for it to work. The only way it's going to work is if the entire if statement actually gets scheduled and executed in one time slice, then it works. So in the middle of a time slice, some other thread runs, bad things can happen as we just saw. Okay, this is called a race condition. It means that the scheduling actually impacts what the code is doing, which it shouldn't. It should always be correct. Okay, so clearly this is not going to work. We have to find another solution. So what do we do? Okay, so we'll look at solution 2. which is we are going to now leave some labeled nodes, okay, and see what happens here. So here, what the thread is going to do is you're first going to leave a note, and then you're going to make the check. Because in the previous case, because there was no note, you entered the if statement, so you're going to say, before I even open the fridge, I'm going to leave a note, and I open the fridge, and I look inside. So if I get scheduled out while I'm looking in the fridge, there is already a note, so thread B is not going to do it. And that's the basic idea of this solution. Okay, so you leave a note, and then you check, did the other thread leave a note? That's why the notes are labeled, because you left a note. If you look for your own note, you won't do anything. So if you leave note A, you check for note B. There's no note B and no milk, you go buy milk. Okay? Here you're going to leave a note with your name on it. You look for a note with the other thread's name. Okay? And if there is no note and there is no milk, you're going to buy milk. Then you're going to remove the note. Okay? So now this is a different solution. Trying to be clever. Does it work?
Is this going to work, not work in the opposite way? What if it does leave note A and then it schedules to the next process and it says leave note B and put it back and no one's put it back up?
Okay, good point. Yes. Do something, same thing. Okay. So the observation here is you are going to have a problem if you leave a note, okay, and then time slice expires. So now when B runs, it leaves a note, time slice expires again. Okay. You come back to A, okay, you run the next statement. You say, is there a note from B? Now there is one, because you actually, between these two statements, you had a time slice expire, you executed a statement of B and you came back. So now you say, B has left a note, not my problem, I'm going to take. Okay, and then maybe the time slice expires again. And then you come back here, okay, and say, is there a note from A? There is still one. There's nothing to do. A is going to buy milk, it's not my problem. Okay, then time slice expires again. Both of the threads are going to take the note off. Okay? And you can make this go in a while loop, and all you're doing is you're putting a note, checking for the other thread's note. You see a note, you take off for the note, and then you just do something, and neither of you buy milk. Okay? This is the equivalent of you left a note, but before you looked at the fridge, you went to the bathroom or some such thing, and you came back, you saw a note from your roommate, and you assume that your roommate is going to buy milk, so you decide to do something else, and your roommate sees your note, and neither of you are buying milk. Okay? So this is going to have the opposite problem of not having any milk at all. Okay? The previous solution actually had too much milk. Here you have no milk. Okay? This again depends on a bad scheduling order, but your code shouldn't depend on how the OS schedules it. You could argue that that's a very rare case. It may not happen this way, so on and so forth, but that's not correct code still. If it happens, if the threads get scheduled in that way, your code will actually not function. So you cannot depend on, so the OS can schedule your threads in any order it wants, and your code should still work. So here you have the opposite problem of moment. Is that clear? Any questions on this? So now we'll go on to the yet another solution. Okay, we are going to make the same code, take the same code we had in the previous slide and generalize it a little bit. Thread B has the same code. And you leave a node to check for the node from the other thread if there's no milk to buy milk and so on. Okay? In this case, we are going to add a statement. You leave a node, and while there is no node from B, you are going to sit in a loop. Okay? And then once your loop exists, once you see a node, then you are going to check if there is no milk and you buy milk. Okay? So the real world analogy here is you basically leave a node. Okay? And let's say you are paranoid that the previous scenario will occur. So you are going to stand at the fridge, not move, until you actually see some note and some milk. Yeah, the other thread will just see a note and go off and do something. So one of the threads is more paranoid, it's just waiting, sitting in a while loop, waiting for a note to appear and then check. Okay? So now if one of the threads is doing extra work and being more paranoid, will that work? Any thoughts on this? Yes.
Still no, I think.
Okay.
The first thread gets passed, reviews a note and then gets passed the while loop because he hasn't done it yet. He gets scheduled off on this section.
Come again, you said the first thread is going to go past the while loop.
Yeah. And then if it gets scheduled off at that point, he will leave the node.
Okay, so you are here. Okay, that means you left a node. You now found a node from B. Okay, now you got scheduled out. What's thread B do?
And then reviews a node, sees that,
So thread B has left a node and you still have a node there. Right? So you will basically just not do anything, you will exit here. There's a node. And now you are here, there is no mill. So you will actually go back. Right? Yes.
While node should say while no node. Is that right?
No, while you have a node there, you're waiting. So your roommate left a note. Do I trust him or her enough that they actually want build? Or did they just leave a note and take off? Okay. So now I'm going to claim, but not prove to you, that this code actually works. And here is a short proof which we are not going to go into at all. Okay, because if you convince yourself that if one thread is more parallel and you're checking, you left a node, you better bring milk, otherwise I will actually go buy milk because I don't trust you enough, which will actually work. Yes.
Based on the solution, is it advisable to always have like a thread created that acts almost like a signal that after all threads theoretically are completed, it goes through and make sure all the pieces of code have actually been.
Okay, so you are asking, alright, so let us write code such that we always have one paranoid thread that double checks on every other thread and did you do what you were supposed to do. You could write code that way. You could write code this way as well, but I want to claim this is not a good way to write code. Okay? Or at least a complicated way to write code. So the answer is this code actually works. Okay? There is actually an argument as to why that works because you can analyze all possible scenarios. What after each statement you can assume that the thread got slides out and some other thread ran, and you can go through all the scenarios and you will see that always you'll end up if there's no milk, you'll end up with milk. You won't have either no milk or too much milk, regardless of how things get scheduled. Yeah? There's an underlying assumption about load stores being atomic, but we won't go into all that. But the point of the matter is, if you have to do such a simple task and write this complicated code and have to convince yourself that this is actually going to work by analyzing all possible scenarios, what happens if you have to write more complicated applications that have to do more complicated tasks together? Okay. How are you going to accomplish that if your code is going to get very messy very soon? And this is just 2 threads trying to do this. What if there are 3? And you have one very paranoid, one moderately paranoid, and one lazy roommate, and does that work? I mean, how are you going to write all this code? Right? So the argument is that it works, but you have to go through a lot of trouble to convince yourself it works. And I actually haven't convinced you. I just asserted, and I showed you a slide that has some argument, which you can go and read. Okay? But I'm not going to go through. So the point is, this is a solution, but it's not a good solution. It's too complicated. It's hard to convince ourselves that it works. You may still be not convinced. You may think I can find a way it doesn't work. It does, but you can go and try to figure out if it does or doesn't. Okay? So, and the third part, which is actually also very important, 2 important points is A, in this thread A is doing what is called busy waiting. It's sitting in a loop doing nothing. That loop is actually executing and consuming CPU cycles. Okay, so CPU is just spinning, the thread is just spinning in that loop and CPU is wasting cycles just making this thread wait. Yeah? Busy waiting is never a good thing. It consumes CPU cycles but accomplishes nothing. It was not a traditional I/O wait where you're scheduled off and you go and wait for something to happen. Busy wait means you're actually waiting but sitting in a loop and executing a null statement, which is actually consuming CPU cycle. That's not a good thing. So any solution that has busy wait is going to be wasting CPU cycles. You don't want that. Second is the code is asymmetric. Okay? Thread A and thread B are doing the same task, but they actually execute different parts of different code. That code that does different things. You don't want that either. Okay? Symmetric code means when you generalize it beyond 2, you are going to be immediately interval. 2 is okay. If you have to do 4, then each of them has slightly different code and it doesn't generalize to n very easily. Okay? So you want something that is better than all of these solutions. Okay, this is where synchronization comes in. Okay? So if you use some additional primitives that the system provides you, you can write this code in a very straightforward manner and quickly convince yourself that this code actually works. It does the right thing and so on, because the primitives that you are using guarantee you something. The properties of those primitives or those methods you are using actually will guarantee you things so that you don't have to reason too much. And the first one we are going to look at is lock, which you may have seen. I'll define what that is in just a moment. And there are two others we are going to encounter called semaphores, which try to generalize locks. And then there's one more called monitors, which is actually built into Java. So if you use Java, monitors come for almost free. You don't have to do anything other than use one keyword. Okay? So what is a lock? A lock is a primitive that allows a process to hold a lock at any given time until you release the lock. So think of this as a room. If you want to do some task, you want to enter the room and you have to get a key and lock the room. And only you can be in the room at any given time. And then once you're done performing the activity, you exit the room and then some other thread can enter the room. Okay, that's the essential concept of a lock. Instead of a room, we'll have a piece of code. Okay, that's called a critical section. So to execute that critical section, you have to first try to get a lock. And the definition of a lock is only one thread can get a lock at any given time. The lock is either in free or is in use. The lock is in use and other thread tries to get it. It will be told the lock is in use, or wait. Somebody else is using, executing the critical section, wait. The lock will give you this property. Okay? And then we'll see how to implement our solution using a lock. Yes, you can do the same thing with semaphores and monitors. Okay, so before I show the solution, I want to just define how locks work. So there are two methods for a lock acquire and a lock release. Okay, that's pseudocode. So the way lock acquire works is whenever a thread calls lock acquire, this lock acquire method is going to check is the lock free or in use. If the lock is free, you get the lock. If the lock is in use, you are blocked. You have to wait until whatever thread is holding the lock releases the lock. Okay, so if you try to grab a lock and some other thread holds the lock, you will actually wait. Okay, meaning you will be put to sleep and then you will be woken up. So then goes with the acquire, you have the release. So whenever a thread that holds the lock calls release, it gives up the lock. And then it either becomes free or it's given to some other thread that's waiting. If there's a thread waiting, it will get the lock. If there's no thread waiting, the lock state will be free. Okay, so those are the two methods for using a lock, and here are the rules. You always acquire the lock before entering a critical section or before accessing any shared data, and always release the lock once you're done with the critical section or accessing the data. And the lock is initially set to free. Initialization for the locks is it's free. Initially the lock is not in use. Okay? So with that rules, you can now look at the too much milk problem, which has now become very simple. You just basically just have this method. If there is no milk, go buy milk. This statement is protected as a critical section by a lock acquire and a lock release. Okay? And the lock is going to do all the hard work for us now. Okay, our code has become very simple. It's a one-line if statement at this point. So all that thread is doing is acquire a lock. Okay? Then check if there is milk or not. If there is no milk, go buy milk. And when you are doing this, the lock property is guaranteeing to you that if you are executing this code, no other thread can execute the code. If they try to acquire a lock, they'll all be blocked. Okay, so by definition, if you're checking whether there is milk or if you've gone off to go buy milk, it's like you put a lock on the refrigerator so the other roommate cannot even check if there is milk or not. So they can't do anything. Okay, so they cannot do any harm, they're just waiting. Okay? And thread B is going to do the same thing. So now it doesn't matter what the scheduler does anymore. Okay? You could acquire a lock and then your time slice may expire and something else may run. But when something else, in this case, if it happens with thread B, this cannot even go inside the critical section. You will block them until you call lock release. Okay? Because that's the property of a lock. Once you acquire the lock, any thread, all other threads that call lock acquire will be blocked at that first stage. You will only be able to enter one at a time after some other thread is called lock release. This question.
So if they had multiple threads and the lock has been acquired already, do they wait the user to
Yeah, so the implementation of a lock, which I will show you, will actually have an internal queue. Okay, whenever one thread has acquired a lock, any other thread that calls lock acquire will be put on the queue of the lock. And they'll be given the lock one at a time. So this lock property is guaranteeing to you that the critical section can only be executed by one function. Okay, that means that only one entity can check whether there is milk, and if there isn't, go buy milk. No other entity can even do anything. So that should immediately tell you that nothing bad can happen. Okay, you will not have too much milk. You cannot have two entities executing that critical section at once by definition of a law. Okay, is that clear? Any questions on this? So then hopefully we don't have to convince ourselves that this is going to work, because the lock property is such that it should work. If you have a correct implementation of a lock, this is going to work. Okay? We have to see how to implement locks. We haven't seen how the lock is doing all of its magic internally. That's what the goal is here, not how to use them, but how locks are implemented. Yes?
So when thread A used the lock and he didn't get a lock, it's just waiting here.
Question is what? If thread A calls acquire and is blocked, what happens?
Yeah, although it doesn't have the lock yet, so it's just waiting on the first time.
Okay, so you are asking if thread A called lock acquire and the lock is already in use. Let's say thread B ran first, it got the lock. It's going to wait there.
So we were just using CPU time or just...
No, so here I haven't shown you how locks are implemented, but typically when you call lock acquire, that's equivalent to the same as doing I/O. If the lock is in use, you will be put in the wait queue until the lock is available. You are not going to sit and busy wait. You can have implementations of lock that do busy wait also, but the efficient ones won't do that. Okay? So here wait doesn't mean so the lock is doing the same thing that your paranoid roommate was doing, sitting there and waiting in a loop, except that is going to do it more efficiently, makes the code much simpler. Yes?
So do you need a different lock for the cheese? Like if you had a different critical section, you obviously need a different lock.
Yes. So every critical section gets its own lock. Okay? So if you have some other task independent of this task, you have lock 2. Locks are just like integer variables. Okay, I didn't give them names here, but you will say log I, log j, log k. So then you go I dot acquire and I dot e. So each critical section gets its own lock. You can have one lock for all of them, but then you will not have concurrency. So if you are in one critical section, no other critical section can run. For concurrency purposes, to get more parallelism of concurrency, you should have a separate lock for each critical section. Other questions here? So we have maybe 3 minutes left. I'm going to introduce these terms and then we'll actually look at them next. Okay, now having understood most of this material, I presume you have actually encountered in 230. I was just refreshing, or if not, that's fine. Now we know what it is. But our real goal is to now see how locks are giving us atomicity and allow us to do mutual exclusion and so on. Okay, this is where we are going to depend on hardware. In the very second or third class, when I was talking about hardware concepts, I had mentioned that you need some hardware support for synchronization. Now we are going to look at what it is, how it's used and so on. So there are 2 or 3 different things that the hardware can do, and it makes implementation of a lock by an operating system designer easier. Okay? The first one is the ability to disable interrupts. Okay? There's also another special assembly instruction that you can use called the test and set instruction, which was mentioned earlier, and we'll look at that as well. And the third thing which all hardware CPUs will do is to ensure that loads and stores are atomic, which we will ignore more or less. We'll see how to implement locks using disabling interrupts, and we'll see how to implement locks using test and set. Okay? So disabling interrupts, I'm going to give you an intuition, and we'll come back to it next time. So the way you are going to make locks work by disabling interrupts is, so what disabling interrupts means is if you execute any code while the interrupts are disabled, if actually an interrupt occurs in the system, it will be ignored. You will not actually suspend the execution of this process and start executing something else and so Okay, how do we use it in this context? The way CPU scheduling works is you use timers. You remember what I mentioned last time. Whenever you schedule a process or a task, you set a timer. When the timer expires, it raises an interrupt, saying time is up. Okay? CPU scheduler runs, picks another task. Okay? So now, essentially, by disabling interrupt, we are going to temporarily disable the CPU scheduler itself. Okay? We are going to say, I am in a critical section. I cannot be descheduled until the critical section is run. And you run the whole critical section without the time slice expiring. The time slice is going to run as long as it needs to until the critical section ends. Okay? That's one way of achieving synchronization. You prevent the time slice from expiring, prevent the CPU scheduler from running something else. Okay? So that's one way to do it. That's what enabling and disabling interrupt does. But if you have a long critical section, that's going to be a problem because you actually disabled the scheduler and you can run for a long period and nothing else will run in the meantime. The scheduler will not allow, the timer will go off, but nothing will happen. Yeah, so better way to do it is to use additional hardware support, which are special assembly instructions that are designed specifically to implement locks. And one of them is called the test and set instruction. When we look at how to use both of these techniques next time, but it should be clear at least how to use interrupts, disable the scheduler temporarily. Okay, so we'll stop here for today.